Rhaegar's antennae twitched with disgust as she gazed upon the blue-green orb through the view screen. Earth, a primitive backwater, teeming with unworthy lifeforms. The Evora scientists' mission was clear: study, assess, and prepare for potential colonization. She never imagined this unremarkable planet would challenge everything she believed. The sleek Evora ship touched down in a remote wilderness area, cloaked from human detection. Rhaegar, revered among her kind for both her intellect and striking appearance, led her team in establishing a temporary research base. Their mandibles clicked in anticipation as they unpacked advanced scanning equipment and portable labs. Unbeknownst to the aliens, they weren't alone in this secluded expanse. Chris Grant, a seasoned park ranger, patrolled the area on his routine rounds. His keen eyes spotted an unnatural shimmer in the air, the edge of the Evora's cloaking field. Curiosity overrode caution as he crept closer, observing the strange beings and their unfamiliar technology. Rhaegar's sensors pinged, alerting her to the human's presence. "Capture that specimen," she ordered, her voice a melodious trill. "We require a subject for preliminary examinations." Chris's survival instincts kicked in. He bolted through the underbrush, heart pounding. But even his years of wilderness experience were no match for Evora tech. A pulse of energy enveloped him, and darkness claimed his consciousness. He awoke on a cold examination table, limbs restrained. Alien faces peered down at him, their compound eyes reflecting the harsh laboratory lights. Chris struggled against his bonds as the aliens methodically removed his clothing, preparing him for study. Rhaegar approached, her iridescent exoskeleton gleaming. She began a thorough examination of the human's physiology, cataloging differences from Evora biology. When she reached his pelvic region, she paused. Her antennae quivered with a mix of repulsion and fascination. "What is this appendage?" she chittered to her colleagues. The human male's reproductive organs were unlike anything in Evora anatomy. Rhaegar found herself oddly captivated. Her scientific curiosity piqued despite her disdain for the species. As Rhaegar continued her examination, Chris's mind raced. He needed to prove humans weren't the simple-minded creatures these aliens believed them to be. He began to speak, hoping to establish some form of communication. Meanwhile, beyond the isolated research site, Earth's governments had detected the Evora presence. Military forces mobilized and diplomats engaged in heated debates. The threat of global conflict loomed as humanity grappled with the reality of first contact. Back in the lab, Rhaegar found herself at a crossroads. Her mission parameters were clear, but the more she studied Chris, the more her preconceptions crumbled. The human displayed problem-solving skills, adaptability, and a complexity she hadn't expected. And that strange anatomy, it hinted at reproductive strategies vastly different from her own species. Chris sensed the alien scientist's internal conflict. Despite his vulnerable position, he persisted in attempts to communicate, to demonstrate human intelligence and resilience. Each interaction chipped away at Rhaegar's prejudices. As the hours passed, Rhaegar faced an unprecedented dilemma. Her duty to the Evora mission clashed with her growing fascination with humans, particularly this male specimen. She found herself lingering in the lab, asking questions beyond the scope of her research, drawn to Chris in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. The stage was set for a collision of worlds. Earth teetered on the brink of war, the Evora mission hung in the balance, and in a secluded laboratory, an unlikely connection began to form, one that could reshape the future of both species. As the hours stretched into days, the isolated laboratory became a crucible of conflicting emotions and duties. Rhaegar found herself spending increasingly long periods observing Chris, her compound eyes drinking in every detail of his alien form. The human's resilience and adaptability fascinated her, challenging her preconceived notions with each passing moment. Chris, despite his precarious position, refused to succumb to fear or hopelessness. He watched Rhaegar intently, noting the subtle shifts in her body language and the way her antennae twitched when she was deep in thought. Seizing an opportunity during one of her examinations, he began to speak. "I know you can understand me," Chris said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "We're not the simple creatures you think we are. Let me show you." Rhaegar's mandibles clicked in surprise. She hesitated, then nodded almost imperceptibly. Over the next few days, Chris demonstrated human ingenuity in ways that left Rieger astounded. Using materials from his holding cell, bits of alien alloy, discarded sensor components, even fibers from his own clothing, he fashioned crude but effective tools. A makeshift lever to test the strength of his restraints, a rudimentary sundial to track the passage of time. Each creation spoke volumes about human resourcefulness. As Rieger conducted further examinations, her fascination grew. She discovered unique aspects of human physiology that both intrigued and perplexed her. The complexity of the human nervous system, the intricate dance of hormones and neurotransmitters, the remarkable plasticity of the human brain, all of it challenged her understanding of biology. "Your species is remarkable," Rieger admitted one day, her voice a melodious trill tinged with newfound respect. "Tell me more about your world." Chris seized the opportunity, sharing stories of Earth's diverse ecosystems, the myriad cultures that span the globe, and humanity's tireless quest for knowledge. With each tale, he chipped away at Rieger's prejudices, painting a picture of a species worthy of understanding rather than conquest. Outside the confines of the Evora base, the world teetered on the brink of chaos. Governments around the globe scrambled to respond to the alien presence, their militaries on high alert. In a top-secret facility, Colonel James Harding briefed his hand-picked team of operatives. "Our mission is clear," Harding said, his weathered face etched with purpose. "We locate the alien base, assess the threat, and extract any human captives. The fate of our species may well rest on what we discover." As Harding's team deployed to the wilderness where the Evora ship had been detected, Rieger found herself at odds with her superiors. Her reports, once clinical and detached, now brimmed with insights into human potential. This shift did not go unnoticed. "Your objectivity is compromised, Scientist Rieger," Zartek, the mission commander, chittered angrily. "Remember our purpose here. These humans are subjects for study, nothing more." Rieger's antenna drooped in submission, but inwardly she seethed. The more time she spent with Chris, the more she questioned the Evora's intentions. In her private laboratory, Rieger made a startling discovery. Her own body was changing, producing hormones eerily similar to those found in humans. The implications sent her reeling. Could there be some unforeseen biological compatibility between their species? As she grappled with this revelation, Chris's health began to deteriorate. The alien environment and unsuitable diet took their toll, leaving him weak and feverish. Rieger, driven by a concern she couldn't fully comprehend, took action. Under the cover of darkness, she adjusted the atmospheric settings in Chris's cell, bringing them closer to Earth norms. She synthesized nutrients that approximated human dietary needs, secretly administering them to her weakening captive. "Why are you helping me?" Chris asked, his voice hoarse but grateful. Rieger's compound eyes shimmered with an emotion she couldn't name. I don't know," she admitted, "but I cannot bear to see you suffer." This act of compassion did not go unnoticed. Other Evora scientists, loyal to the mission's original parameters, reported Rieger's actions to Zartek. The commander's response was swift and merciless. "The human specimen is to be terminated immediately," Zartek ordered, his voice cold and unyielding. "Prepare it for final dissection and analysis." Rieger, overhearing this command, felt as though her world had shattered. In that moment, she made a choice that would alter the course of both their species. Moving with urgent precision, she entered Chris's cell. "We must go," she whispered, her mandibles clicking rapidly in agitation. "Your life is in danger." As alarms blared throughout the facility, Rieger guided Chris through a labyrinth of corridors. Her knowledge of Evora technology allowed them to bypass security systems, but she knew their lead wouldn't last long. Outside the base, Colonel Harding and his team had established a perimeter. They watched in awe as energy signatures within the alien structure spiked erratically. "Something's happening in there," Harding muttered. "Prepare to move in." Inside, Chris and Rieger found themselves trapped between converging threats. Evora security forces approached from one direction, while the sounds of Harding's team breaching the facility echoed from another. In a narrow corridor, With the chaos of alarms and shouts surrounding them, Chris and Rhaegar faced a moment of truth. Evora weapons hummed with deadly energy. Human voices shouted commands, underlaid with the ominous click of firearms being readied. Chris, unarmed and still weakened, stood at the center of this maelstrom. He looked at Rhaegar, then at the human soldiers, and finally at the advancing Evora security team led by a furious Zartek. "Wait!" Chris shouted, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to give everyone pause. "We don't have to fight. There's another way." In that fragile moment of hesitation, the fate of two species hung in the balance. Chris took a deep breath, preparing to bridge the gap between two worlds, while Rhaegar watched with a mixture of fear and hope, her antennae quivering with the weight of her choices. Choices. His eyes darted between the human soldiers and the Evora security team, both poised for violence. Taking a deep breath, Chris stepped forward, placing himself directly between the two factions. "Everyone, please lower your weapons," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "We have an opportunity here for understanding, not conflict." Colonel Harding's grip on his rifle tightened. "Son, step aside. These aliens are hostile." "No, Colonel," Chris countered, standing his ground. "They're scientists, explorers. Their technology is beyond our comprehension. A fight here would be disastrous for Earth." He turned to face Zartek and the Evora forces, switching to the clicks and trills he had learned during his captivity. "And you? Humans aren't simple test subjects. We're a species of innovators, problem solvers. We could be valuable allies, not specimens." Rhaegar moved to Chris's side, her iridescent exoskeleton catching the harsh light of the corridor. "He speaks the truth," she added, addressing both groups. "There's more connecting our species than dividing us." She hesitated, antenna twitching nervously, before continuing. "Our research has uncovered unexpected biological compatibilities between humans and Evora. This could revolutionize our understanding of xenobiology." A murmur rippled through both groups. Colonel Harding lowered his weapon slightly, curiosity overtaking caution. "What kind of compatibilities?" Zartek chittered to his security team, who reluctantly powered down their energy weapons. "Explain, Scientist Rhaegar. How is this possible?" For the next several minutes, Rhaegar outlined their findings, describing the hormone changes and genetic markers that hinted at a deeper connection between their species. As she spoke, the tension in the air gradually dissipated, replaced by a cautious fascination. Colonel Harding holstered his sidearm, a calculating look in his eyes. "If what you're saying is true, the scientific potential here is enormous, not to mention the technological advancements we could gain from peaceful cooperation." He turned to Chris. "We need to take this up the chain of command. A full diplomatic summit between Earth's leaders and the Evora, what did you call it? High Command?" Zartek's compound eyes narrowed, but he nodded slowly. "Such a meeting could be beneficial. Our mission parameters may need to be reevaluated in light of this new information." As the two leaders began discussing logistics, Chris felt a wave of relief wash over him. He looked at Rhaegar, seeing his own mix of exhaustion and hope reflected in her alien features. Over the next few weeks, Chris found himself thrust into the center of rapidly evolving human-Evora relations. The U.S. government, recognizing his unique position, recruited him as a key advisor and liaison. Rhaegar, defying Evora protocol, insisted on remaining by his side, citing the need for continued research on their biological compatibility. They spent long hours together, preparing for the upcoming summit. Their conversations ranged from detailed discussions of comparative physiology to personal reflections on their vastly different upbringings. "Tell me about your family structure," Rhaegar asked one evening, her antennae twitching with curiosity. "The concept of parents is still so foreign to me." Chris smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Well, in my case, I grew up with a mom and dad, 2 parents. But human families come in all shapes and sizes. Single parents, same-sex couples, extended families living together." Rhaegar's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. "Such diversity. Evora reproduction is much more standardized, efficient perhaps, but lacking in the emotional bonds you describe." As they worked and talked, Chris found himself growing increasingly attached to Rhaegar. Her analytical mind, tempered by a newfound curiosity about human emotions, fascinated him. For her part, Rhaegar was continually amazed by the depth and complexity of human social interactions. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed. While many humans and Evora alike saw their relationship as a symbol of hope for future cooperation, others viewed it with suspicion and fear. Marcus Graves, a former military officer with a deep-seated mistrust of anything alien, began gathering like-minded individuals. His group, Earth First, launched a series of attacks on infrastructure, aiming to disrupt the upcoming negotiations. Humans and aliens can't coexist, Graves railed in underground meetings and encrypted online forums. These Evora are here to conquer us, not befriend us. We must strike first. Simultaneously, within the Evora ranks, Science Officer Pel Tora watched Rhaegar's behavior with growing alarm. Her attachment to the human specimen is unnatural, Pel Tora hissed to a group of sympathetic colleagues. It threatens the purity of our species. They must both be eliminated before the summit. Unaware of these gathering storms, Chris and Rhaegar made a discovery that would change everything. During a routine medical scan, they found that Rhaegar's body had begun producing hormones compatible with human physiology. Even more shockingly, her reproductive system showed signs of adapting to potentially carry human-Evora hybrid offspring. This is unprecedented, Rhaegar whispered, her usual scientific detachment cracking under the weight of the implications. The genetic possibilities are staggering. Chris stared at the readouts, a mix of excitement and fear coursing through him. Rhaegar, do you realize what this means? We could actually have a child together, a true blending of our species. Their eyes met, a moment of understanding passing between them. The possibility was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. As news of this development leaked, public opinion on Earth fractured. Some hailed it as a beautiful step towards interspecies harmony, while others decried it as the beginning of the end for human identity. The Evora High Command was equally divided, with progressives seeing it as an evolutionary leap forward, and conservatives viewing it as a dilution of their species. Chris and Rhaegar found themselves at the center of a media firestorm, their private lives suddenly thrust into the global spotlight. Every gesture, every word between them was analyzed and debated by pundits and politicians alike. Despite the chaos surrounding them, Chris and Rhaegar began to tentatively discuss the possibility of starting a family. They were acutely aware that their decision would have far-reaching consequences for both their species. "Are we ready for this?" Chris asked one night, his voice barely above a whisper. "The whole world is watching us, Rhaegar. Whatever we decide, it's bigger than just us now." Rhaegar's antennae drooped slightly, a gesture Chris had come to recognize as a sign of deep thought. "I don't know if anyone can truly be ready for something like this," she replied, "but I believe it's a step we must take for the future of both our peoples." As the date of the summit drew near, Chris and Rhaegar threw themselves into preparations, their personal hopes for a future together now inextricably linked with the fate of human-Evora relations. They worked tirelessly, drafting proposals for scientific cooperation, cultural exchange programs, and legal frameworks for interspecies relationships. What they didn't know was that both Marcus Graves and Pel Tora were converging on the summit location, each with their own plans to derail the negotiations and eliminate the threat of interspecies integration. As Chris and Rhaegar finalized their presentation for the gathered world leaders and Evora High Command, unseen forces were moving into position, ready to shatter the fragile peace they had worked so hard to build. The air crackled with tension as Chris and Rhaegar entered the conference room, surrounded by a mix of human and Evora security personnel. Major Frank Thompson, newly assigned to their detail, scanned the room with practiced efficiency. "Stay close," he murmured, his hand never straying far from his sidearm. "We've got hostiles on both sides." Chris nodded, acutely aware of the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He glanced at Rhaegar, her iridescent exoskeleton shimmering under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her antennae twitched nervously, picking up on the undercurrents of anxiety in the room. As they took their seats, a commotion erupted outside. Angry shouts and the sound of breaking glass filtered through the reinforced doors. Major Thompson's hand flew to his earpiece. "Earth First extremists," he reported grimly. "They're trying to breach the perimeter." Zartek chittered in alarm, his compound eyes swiveling towards the exits. "This is unacceptable. The summit must proceed without interruption." Before anyone could respond, alarms blared throughout the facility. Red emergency lights bathed the room in an eerie glow. Chris felt his heart rate spike as he realized the gravity of the situation. "We need to move," Major Thompson barked, already on his feet. "Secure location now." As they hurried through the corridors, Chris couldn't help but notice the looks of disgust and fear directed at Rigor from some of the human staff. The news of their relationship and its implications had clearly spread, polarizing opinions on both sides. They reached a reinforced safe room just as another explosion rocked the building. Inside, banks of monitors displayed chaos unfolding across the globe. Evora outposts under attack. Crowds of protesters clashing with riot police. News tickers scrolling with increasingly alarming headlines. "It's not just here," Chris breathed, taking in the scope of the crisis. "This is happening everywhere." Rigor moved closer to him, her normally steady hands trembling slightly. "Chris," she whispered, "I don't feel well." He turned to her, concern etched across his face. That's when he noticed the faint sheen of sweat on her exoskeleton, the unnatural droop of her antenna. Something was wrong. "We need a medical team here now," Chris shouted, supporting Rigor as she swayed on her feet. The next few hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. As medics swarmed around Rigor, running tests and administering treatments, Chris found himself pulled into emergency meetings with both human and Evora officials. "The situation is deteriorating rapidly," a stern-faced general informed them. "We've got reports of Earth First cells mobilizing in major cities worldwide, and the Evora High Command is threatening to pull out of the summit entirely." Chris ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion and stress taking their toll. "We can't let that happen. Everything we've worked for, the future of both our species, it all hinges on this summit." Just then, Major Thompson burst into the room, his face ashen. "Sir, we've got a problem. The doctors have finished their initial tests on Rigor." Chris felt his blood run cold. "What is it? What's wrong with her?" Thompson hesitated, glancing at the other officials before continuing. "She's pregnant, sir, and from what they can tell, it's a human-Evora hybrid." The room erupted into chaos. Shouts of disbelief, anger, and fear bounced off the walls. Chris stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the information. "That's not all," Thompson continued, raising his voice to be heard above the din. "They've detected some kind of engineered virus in her system. It's attacking the changes in her biology that made this pregnancy possible." As the implications sank in, Chris felt a surge of willpower. He turned to the assembled officials, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "This changes everything," he said. "We're not just fighting for diplomacy anymore. We're fighting for the future of both our species, a future that's already begun." In the medical bay, Rigor lay on a bed surrounded by a mix of human and Evora doctors. Monitors beeped steadily, displaying a dizzying array of data from both her own vital signs and those of the developing hybrid child within her. Chris sat by her side, holding her hand as best he could given the differences in their anatomy. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly. Rager's mandibles clicked weakly. "The pain. It's unlike anything I've experienced," she managed. "But I can feel the child, Chris. It's strong." A human doctor approached, her face grave. "We've identified the virus," she reported. "It's unlike anything we've seen before, a perfect blend of human and Evora bioengineering." "Can you neutralize it?" Chris asked, hope and fear warring in his voice. The doctor shook her head. "Not with our current knowledge. We'd need a breakthrough in both human and Evora medical science." As if on cue, alarms began blaring once again. Major Thompson burst into the room, his rifle at the ready. "We've got incoming," he shouted. "Earth first, at least 24 heavily armed. They're after you and Rigor." Chris looked down at Rager, then at the monitors showing their child's vital signs. In that moment, he made a decision that would alter the course of history. "Do it," he said to the assembled medical team. "Whatever it takes. Use me as a test subject if you have to. We need to find a cure." As the sounds of gunfire echoed in the distance, Chris was wheeled into an operating room. The last thing he saw before the anesthesia took hold was Rhaegar's face, a mix of fear and hope in her alien features. The fate of two species, and the child that represented their shared future, now hung in the balance. Balance. Chris's vision faded to black as the anesthesia took hold, his last conscious thought a silent prayer for Rhaegar and their unborn child. The operating room erupted into a flurry of activity. Human and Evora doctors worked side by side, their differences momentarily forgotten in the face of this unprecedented medical challenge. Monitors beeped steadily, tracking Chris's vital signs as they began the delicate procedure to stimulate his immune system and produce the necessary antibodies. Dr. Elena Sato, the lead human physician, carefully inserted a needle into Chris's arm. "Initiating the antigen introduction," she announced, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Let's hope his body responds quickly." Across the room, Rhaegar lay on a separate bed, her iridescent exoskeleton dulled by illness. Dr. Zinvex, her Evora counterpart, hovered nearby, multifaceted eyes fixed on the monitors displaying her deteriorating condition. Suddenly, alarms blared throughout the facility. The lights flickered ominously, and the faint sound of gunfire echoed in the distance. Dr. Sato's head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. "What's happening?" she demanded, struggling to be heard over the cacophony. The operating room door burst open, and Major Frank Thompson rushed in, his uniform disheveled and a sheen of sweat on his brow. "Earth First extremists," he reported grimly. "They've breached the outer defenses. We need to move you to a more secure location." Dr. Sato shook her head vehemently. "Impossible. We can't interrupt the procedure now. Chris's life hangs in the balance, not to mention Rhaegar and the child." Thompson's expression resolute, but he nodded in understanding. "Then we'll hold them off here. I've got a team setting up defensive positions around the medical wing." As Thompson coordinated the defense, the medical team redoubled their efforts. The facility's power fluctuated wildly, threatening to disrupt the delicate equipment. Dr. Zinvex chittered in frustration as he manually adjusted Rhaegar's life support systems. "Her condition is worsening," he reported, mandibles clicking anxiously. "We need those antibodies soon, or we'll lose both her and the child." Outside, the sounds of battle intensified. Marcus Graves, the leader of Earth First, had personally joined the assault. His voice carried over the chaos, filled with hate and commitment. "Find the alien and her human collaborator," he shouted. "We end this abomination today." Inside the operating room, Chris's body began to respond to the treatment. Dr. Sato allowed herself a moment of hope as she observed the first signs of antibody production. "It's working," she breathed. "Now we just need to—" Her words were cut short as Chris's vital signs suddenly spiked. His body convulsed on the table, reacting violently to the procedure. "No, no, no," Dr. Sato muttered, rushing to stabilize him. "Come on, Chris. Fight through this." As the human medical team fought to save Chris, an unexpected ally emerged. Zartek, the Evora ambassador, made a bold decision. Recognizing the potential diplomatic catastrophe if either Chris or Rhaegar died, he authorized Evora reinforcements to assist in defending the facility. The corridors outside the medical wing became a battleground. Human security forces found themselves fighting alongside Evora troops, their shared goal of protecting Chris and Rhaegar temporarily overriding years of mistrust and tension. Major Thompson, coordinating the defense from just outside the operating room, received the news with a mix of surprise and relief. "Evora forces are engaging the hostiles," he reported to Dr. Sato. "It's buying us time, but Graves is still advancing." Inside, the medical team had stabilized Chris and begun the process of transferring the precious antibodies to Rhaegar. Dr. Zinvex prepared the injection, his movements precise despite the chaos around them. Just as hope began to rise, a new threat emerged from within. Pel Tora, the Evora science officer who had long opposed Chris and Rhaegar's relationship, seized her opportunity. Under the guise of assisting, she approached Rhaegar's bedside with a vial of clear liquid. This will help stabilize her system, Peltora explained, reaching for Rager's IV line. But a young Evora nurse, Tilnak, noticed something off about Peltora's behavior. Her antenna twitched suspiciously as she observed the science officer's furtive movements. In a split-second decision, Tilnak lunged forward, knocking the vial from Peltora's hand. "She's trying to sabotage the treatment," Tilnak cried out, her usually melodious voice sharp with alarm. Major Thompson reacted instantly, signaling to two of his human officers. They quickly restrained Peltora, who hissed and struggled against their grip. "You fools," Peltora spat. "You're destroying the purity of both our species." As Peltora was led away, the medical team refocused on their patients. The antibody transfer to Rhaegor was complete, and early readings showed promise. Her vital signs began to stabilize, the unnatural sheen on her exoskeleton fading. But their relief was short-lived. The monitors tracking the hybrid child's life signs began to wail, indicating severe distress. Dr. Sato and Dr. Zinvex exchanged alarmed glances, realizing they were now fighting to save not just Rhaegar, but the unprecedented life growing within her. Rhaegar's eyes fluttered open, her antenna twitching weakly as she registered the concern on the faces around her. "The child," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sounds of battle outside. "Save our child." Dr. Zinvex hesitated for a moment, then made a decision. "There's one option left," he said, turning to Dr. Sato. "Evora healing technology. It's never been tested on humans or hybrids, but—" Dr. Sato nodded grimly. "We're out of alternatives. Do it." As they prepared for this last-ditch effort, the doors to the medical wing finally gave way. Marcus Graves burst in, flanked by his most fanatical followers. They found themselves in a tense standoff, guns trained on the medical team and their patients. "Step away from the alien," Graves snarled, his eyes wild with hatred and fear. In that moment, Chris's eyes opened. Despite his weakened state, he pushed himself up, placing his body between Graves and Rhaegar. His voice was hoarse but steady as he addressed the man who had come to destroy everything he and Rhaegar had worked for. "Look around you, Marcus," Chris said, gesturing to the human and Evora medical staff working side by side. "This is the future. Not division, not hatred. Cooperation, understanding, life." Graves hesitated, his purpose visibly shaken by the scene before him. In that moment of uncertainty, Major Thompson and his team struck, disarming and subduing the Earth-First extremists with swift efficiency. As Graves was led away in restraints, Chris turned back to Rhaegar. The Evora healing technology hummed to life, bathing the hybrid child in a soft, pulsating light. The medical team watched in awe as the child's vital signs not only stabilized but strengthened, displaying a resilience that defied their expectations. Chris took Rhaegar's hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that bridged their physiological differences. Together, they watched the first detailed scans of their child appear on the monitor. The image showed a being both alien and familiar, a true blending of human and Evora traits. As news of the events at the medical facility began to spread, Chris and Rhaegar knew that their challenges were far from finished. The image of their hybrid child would become a powerful symbol, inspiring hope in some and fear in others. But for now, in this moment of hard-won peace, they allowed themselves to simply be two expectant parents, marveling at the miracle of new life. The future remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: the relationship between humans and Evora would never be the same again. The image of Chris and Rhaegar's hybrid child, a fascinating blend of human and Evora traits, spread across the globe like wildfire. News outlets, social media platforms, and scientific journals buzzed with discussions about the implications of this unprecedented union. As Chris regained his strength and Rhaegar's condition stabilized, Dr. Elena Sato approached them with a mixture of relief and concern. "You're both stable enough to be discharged," she said, her eyes flickering to the armed guards outside the medical bay. "But given recent events, the government has concerns about your safety." Chris nodded, his hand instinctively finding Rhaegar's. "What's the plan?" Major Thompson stepped forward, his posture rigid but his eyes betraying a hint of warmth. "We're moving you to a secure compound in Montana, remote, defensible, and equipped with everything you'll need. Rhaegar's antennae twitched, a sign of both curiosity and apprehension. Everything we'll need for what exactly? For your pregnancy, Dr. Sato interjected, and for keeping you safe while the world adjusts to your situation. The journey to Montana was tense, with a convoy of armored vehicles escorting them to awaiting military transport. As they flew over the vast, empty landscape, Chris watched Rhaegar staring out the window, her compound eyes reflecting the patchwork of fields and forest below. "It's beautiful," she whispered, mandibles clicking softly. Chris squeezed her hand. "Our new home?" The compound was a marvel of human engineering in Evora adaptations. High walls surrounded a cluster of buildings, some with standard human architecture, others with the curved, organic shapes preferred by the Evora. A team of scientists and medical professionals greeted them upon arrival, led by Dr. Elena Rodriguez. "Welcome," she said, her smile warm, but her eyes analytical as she observed Rhaegar. "We've prepared a specialized living space for you both. Rhaegar will need to run some tests to ensure we're providing the optimal environment for you and the child." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of medical examinations, dietary adjustments, and environmental tweaks. Chris found himself subjected to daily treatments, his body still adapting to the experimental procedure that had saved Rhaegar and their child. He noticed changes, increased strength, faster reflexes, but also unpredictable energy fluctuations that left him drained and disoriented. One morning, as Chris struggled through a series of physical tests, he noticed Major Thompson watching him with a calculating gaze. The security chief approached, his voice low. "You're stronger now, faster, but you don't know how to use it." Chris wiped sweat from his brow. "What are you suggesting?" Thompson's eyes hardened. "Training. You need to be prepared for whatever comes next." As Chris began combat training with Thompson, Rhaegar faced her own challenges. Her body was changing in ways that puzzled both human and Evora experts. Dr. Rodriguez and her team worked tirelessly to understand and accommodate her needs. One day, during a routine checkup, Rhaegar's eyes widened in alarm. "The plants!" she gasped, pointing to a small garden visible through the window. The flowers and vegetables were growing at an impossible rate, leaves unfurling and stems stretching before their eyes. Dr. Rodriguez frowned, tapping rapidly on her tablet. "Your hormone levels? They're off the charts. And not just Evora hormones. There's something new here." The incident sparked a flurry of new tests and heightened security measures. The compound's botanical research team was brought in to study the mutated plants, while environmental experts assessed potential risk. Amid the chaos, a familiar face arrived at the compound. Dr. Zara, an Evora geneticist of renowned skill, strode into the medical bay with an air of confidence that set human scientists on edge. She carried with her an array of advanced Evora medical equipment, her multifaceted eyes gleaming with scientific curiosity. "I'm here to ensure the well-being of the Evora hybrid," she announced, her mandibles clicking in a way that brooked no argument. Chris watched the tension rise between the human and Evora scientists, a microcosm of the larger conflicts playing out across the globe. News reports showed pro-integration rallies clashing with opposition groups, while political pundits debated the implications of Evora human reproduction. As Rhaegar's pregnancy progressed, Chris found himself torn between his training sessions with Thompson and his desire to be by her side. One evening, exhausted from a particularly grueling combat drill, he entered their shared quarters to find Rhaegar hunched over, chittering in distress. "What's wrong?" he asked, rushing to her side. Rhaegar's antennae drooped. "The child. It moves in ways I don't understand. I feel changed." Before Chris could respond, Dr. Rodriguez burst into the room, followed closely by Dr. Zara. The two doctors, who had been at odds since the Evora geneticist's arrival, now moved with synchronized purpose. "We've had a breakthrough," Dr. Rodriguez announced, her eyes bright with excitement. "A new prenatal care technique, combining our methods with Evora technology." Dr. Zara chittered in agreement. "It should stabilize your condition and promote healthy development of the hybrid offspring." As they began the treatment, Chris stepped back, watching the human and Evora doctors working in harmony. It was a glimpse of the future they had fought for, a future that now grew within Rhaegar. But that future was far from secure. Major Thompson entered the room, his face grim. "We've received word," he said, his voice low. "The Human Evora Summit in Geneva has been confirmed. In 1 month's time." Chris felt a chill run down his spine. He knew what was coming next. Thompson continued, "Your presence is required, both of you." Rhaegor's antenna twitched in alarm. "Is it safe?" "No," Thompson admitted, "but it's necessary. The eyes of both our species will be on Geneva. You need to be there." As the implications sank in, Chris and Rhaegor exchanged a look of understanding. They had become more than just a couple, more than expectant parents. They were a symbol, a turning point in the history of two species. "We'll go," Chris said, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. The next few weeks were a blur of preparations. Thompson drilled Chris relentlessly, honing his new abilities into a formidable skill set. The medical team worked overtime to ensure Rhaegor and the child would be stable for the journey. And all the while, the world watched and waited. The day of departure arrived with a tense, electric atmosphere. As Chris helped Rhaegor board the specially modified aircraft, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the unknown. The plane, a marvel of human and Evora engineering, hummed to life beneath them. As they took off, escorted by a squadron of fighter jets, Chris looked out the window at the compound growing smaller below. He turned to Rhaegor, seeing his own mix of hope and apprehension reflected in her compound eyes. "Whatever happens in Geneva," he said softly, "we face it together." Rhaegor's mandibles clicked in agreement as the plane banked, setting course for a future neither of them could predict. As the plane banked towards Geneva, Chris felt the sudden jolt of turbulence. He instinctively reached for Rhaegor, steadying her as the aircraft shuddered. "Status report," Major Thompson barked into his comlink. "Just air pockets, sir," the pilot's voice crackled back. "Nothing to worry about." But worry was etched on every face in the cabin. Dr. Elena Rodriguez hurried to Rhaegor's side, her hands moving swiftly over a hybrid medical scanner. "How are you feeling?" she asked, eyes fixed on the readout. Rhaegor's antennae twitched. "Unsettled, the child, it reacts to the disturbance." Chris watched as Dr. Rodriguez made minute adjustments to the medical equipment surrounding Rhaegor. The blend of human and Evora technology was a testament to the cooperation they hoped to foster at the summit. As they descended towards the military airfield outside Geneva, Chris caught glimpses of the city through breaks in the cloud cover. Even from this height, he could see the crowds gathering, a patchwork of supporters and protesters that blurred into a sea of uncertainty. The landing was smooth, a stark contrast to the tension that hung in the air. As the plane taxied to a stop, Major Thompson stood, his posture rigid. "Remember the plan," he said, eyes sweeping over the group. "Move fast, stay together. We're exposed out there." The door opened, and Chris blinked against the sudden brightness. A mixed team of human and Evora security personnel surrounded the aircraft, their weapons at the ready. Chris helped Rhaegor to her feet, supporting her as they made their way down the stairs. The armored vehicle waiting for them was a hulking beast, a fusion of human military design and Evora defensive technology. As they approached, Chris noticed the subtle shimmer of an energy field surrounding it. Once inside, the world outside became a muffled blur. Chris watched through tinted windows as they sped through the outskirts of Geneva. Crowds lined the streets, held back by barriers and local law enforcement. Signs flashed by, some welcoming, others hateful. Chris felt Rhaegor tense beside him. "It's okay," he murmured, squeezing her hand. "We're safe." The summit venue loomed ahead, a repurposed palace now filled with security measures. As they pulled up to a hidden entrance, Chris caught sight of other delegations arriving. World leaders stepped out of sleek limousines, their faces a mix of tenacity and apprehension. And then he saw them, the Evora delegation. Led by Zartek, they moved with an otherworldly grace, their compound eyes taking in every detail of their surroundings. Chris felt a surge of hope at the sight. If humans and Evora could work together here, perhaps there was a chance for lasting peace. As they entered the building, Chris noticed Rhaegor's breathing becoming labored. Her steps faltered, and she let out a low, keening sound. "Rhaegor," Chris asked, alarm rising in his voice. Dr. Rodriguez was at their side in an instant, her scanner whirring to life. Her eyes widened as she read the results. "She's going into labor," she announced, her voice tight with concern. The next few moments were a blur of activity. Security personnel cleared a path as they rushed Rager to a nearby room, hastily converted into a makeshift delivery area. Medical equipment was wheeled in, a mix of human and Evora technology that Dr. Rodriguez and her team worked to calibrate. Chris held Rager's hand, feeling the strength in her grip as another contraction hit. Outside, he could hear the murmur of voices as news of the situation spread through the summit. Major Thompson entered the room, his face grim. "We've got a situation," he said in a low voice. "There's been a security breach. Multiple attacks across the city." Before Chris could respond, the lights flickered and went out. Emergency generators hummed to life, bathing the room in a dim red glow. "It's Graves," Thompson growled. "He's here." Chris felt a surge of strength flow through him, his enhanced physiology responding to the threat. He looked at Rager, saw the tenacity in her compound eyes. "Keep her safe," he said to Dr. Rodriguez. Then turning to Thompson, "What do you need me to do?" As they moved to secure the room, Chris heard the distant sound of gunfire. The summit had become a battlefield, and their child was about to be born into a world teetering on the brink of chaos. In that moment, as human and Evora fought side by side to protect the future they had dreamed of, Chris realized that the true test of their unity was just beginning. The sudden silence that followed was deafening. Chris's enhanced reflexes kicked in as he surveyed the room. Dr. Rodriguez worked frantically over Rager, her hands steady despite the chaos. Major Thompson stood at the door, weapon drawn, his eyes scanning for threats. "Push," Dr. Rodriguez urged, her voice cutting through the tension. Rager let out a cry that was part human, part alien, a sound that seemed to bridge two worlds, and then another sound filled the room, the unmistakable wail of a newborn. "It's a boy," Dr. Rodriguez announced, her voice filled with wonder. Chris felt his heart swell as he looked at his son for the first time. The child's skin shimmered with an iridescent quality, catching the dim emergency lighting. His eyes, when they opened, revealed pupils that seemed to shift and change, adapting to the light. "Aiden," Rager chittered softly, her antennae reaching out to touch the infant. The moment of peace was shattered by the sound of an explosion somewhere in the building. Major Thompson's comm link crackled to life. "We need to move," he barked. "Now!" What followed was a blur of activity. Chris cradled Aiden while Dr. Rodriguez helped Rager onto a mobile medical bed. They moved swiftly through the corridors, guided by Thompson's team. The summit building was in chaos. Delegates from various nations huddled in secured rooms, while security forces engaged with unseen assailants. As they passed a shattered window, Chris caught a glimpse of Geneva burning, plumes of smoke rising from multiple locations across the city. They reached the armored vehicle just as another explosion rocked the building. As they sped away from the summit, Chris looked back to see Zartek and the Evora delegation boarding their own transport, their movements a coordinated dance of efficiency. The next few days passed in a haze of security checkpoints and covert transportation. They were moved to a secure medical facility in the Swiss Alps, a state-of-the-art complex hidden beneath a mountain. As Rager recovered and Aiden underwent his first round of tests, Chris found himself glued to the news feeds. The attack on Geneva had been just the beginning. Cities around the world reported similar coordinated strikes, all aimed at disrupting human-Evora relations. "It's Graves," Major Thompson confirmed during a briefing. "He's gone global. Anti-hybrid extremists are rallying to his cause." But the attacks had an unexpected effect. Instead of driving humans and Evora apart, it seemed to unite them. Footage showed human and Evora emergency responders working side by side, saving lives without regard for species. As the days turned into weeks, Chris watched in amazement as Aiden grew at an astonishing rate. By the end of the first month, the infant already displayed cognitive abilities far beyond his age. Dr. Rodriguez entered their quarters one morning, her face a mix of excitement and concern. "The results are in," she said, activating a holographic display. "Aiden's DNA, it's unlike anything we've ever seen. He's not just a combination of human and Evora genes. It's as if his genetic structure is constantly adapting, evolving in real time. Chris watched as Aiden reached out towards the hologram, his tiny fingers changing color to match the light. "What does this mean for him?" he asked. Before Dr. Rodriguez could answer, Major Thompson burst into the room. "We've got a situation," he said, his voice grim. "The UN is convening an emergency session. They want to discuss Aiden." Chris felt a chill run down his spine. He knew this day would come, but he hadn't expected it so soon. As if sensing his father's unease, Aiden let out a soft coo, his eyes shifting to a calming blue. "There's more," Thompson continued. "We've intercepted communications from the Evora High Command. They're pressuring Zartek to bring Rigor and Aiden to their homeworld for further examination." Rager's antennae twitched in alarm. "We can't let that happen," she chittered. "We won't," Chris assured her, even as his mind raced with the implications. The next few hours were a flurry of activity. As Chris and Rigor prepared for a video conference with the UN Security Council, Dr. Rodriguez and her team worked to compile all their data on Aiden's unique physiology. Just before the call, Major Thompson pulled Chris aside. "We've detected chatter about a new threat," he said in a low voice. "A group calling themselves the Purity Coalition. They're after Aiden." Chris felt his newfound strength surge through him, his body tensing for a fight that wasn't yet here. "What do we do?" he asked. Thompson's eyes hardened. "We adapt. We evolve. Just like your son." As they entered the conference room, Chris saw Zartek's face on one of the screens, his compound eyes unreadable. On another, the stern visage of the UN Secretary General looked out at them. "Mr. and Mrs. Keyes," the Secretary General began, "we find ourselves at a crossroads. Your son represents a future we never imagined possible. But with that future comes great responsibility and great danger." Chris took a deep breath, feeling the weight of two worlds on his shoulders. As he prepared to speak, he felt Rhaegor's hand in his, her touch a reminder of everything they had fought for. Aiden, cradled in his mother's arms, looked up at the screens with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. The future of two species hung in the balance, and it all centered on this small family. As Chris began to address the assembled leaders, he knew that whatever came next would change the course of human and Evora history forever. The decision to relocate Chris, Rager, and Aiden to an orbital research facility came swiftly after the UN Security Council meeting. As the family prepared for their journey, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that they were running from one danger into another. The day of departure arrived with a mix of anticipation and unease. Chris helped Rager into their transport vessel, a sleek craft designed for both atmospheric and space travel. Aiden, now resembling a toddler despite being only a few months old, crawled into his mother's lap, his eyes shifting colors as he took in the new surroundings. Dr. Rodriguez approached them as they settled into their seats. "Remember, we'll be monitoring Aiden's vitals throughout the journey," she said, handing Chris a small device. "If anything changes, this will alert us immediately." Chris nodded, pocketing the monitor. He glanced at Major Thompson, who stood near the cockpit, speaking in hushed tones with the pilot. As the engines roared to life, Chris felt a tremor of apprehension. He looked out the window at the Swiss Alps receding below them, wondering if they would ever see Earth's surface again. The journey to the orbital station was smooth, almost unnervingly so. Aiden remained calm throughout, occasionally reaching out to touch the shuttle's interior with fascination. Chris noticed that the child's fingers seemed to glow faintly when they made contact with the ship's systems, but he dismissed it as a trick of the light. As they approached the station, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, tension evident in his tone. "We're experiencing some communication issues with ground control, attempting to establish contact with the station directly." Chris exchanged a worried glance with Rieger. Her antennae twitched, sensing the growing unease in the cabin. Suddenly, the shuttle lurched, throwing Chris against his harness. Alarms blared as the pilot struggled to maintain control. "The automated docking systems are malfunctioning," the pilot shouted. "I'm going to have to attempt a manual dock." As the shuttle approached the station, Chris could see that something was terribly wrong. Sections of the structure were dark, and he spotted debris floating nearby. "What's happening?" Rigor chittered, her grip tightening on Aiden. Before Chris could respond, Aiden let out a soft coo. The child's eyes glowed with an intensity Chris had never seen before. To his amazement, the shuttle's erratic movements began to stabilize. The pilot's voice came over the intercom again, this time filled with awe. "I don't know how, but the systems are responding. We're docking now." As they disembarked, chaos engulfed them. Emergency lights flashed, and the station's gravity fluctuated wildly. Chris stumbled, nearly losing his footing as he helped Rieger and Aiden out of the shuttle. "This way," Dr. Rodriguez called, gesturing towards a nearby corridor. But as they moved, a series of explosions rocked the station. The floor beneath them buckled, and Chris found himself separated from the others by a wall of twisted metal. "Rieger!" he shouted, his enhanced strength allowing him to push aside debris that would have trapped an ordinary human. "Aiden!" He heard Rieger's answering call, muffled but alive. "We're okay, but we can't get through." Chris's mind raced. "Try to make your way to the auxiliary control room," he called back. "I'll meet you there." As he navigated the damaged station, Chris encountered scenes of battle. Human and Evora security forces clashed with a group he didn't recognize, their weapons a mix of familiar and alien technology. He overheard fragments of communication as he moved. Coalition forces, main command center, Krellvox. The name meant nothing to him, but the urgency in the voices told him all he needed to know. This was a coordinated attack, and his family was caught in the middle of it. Chris rounded a corner and found himself face to face with a group of attackers. His enhanced reflexes kicked in as he dodged a blast of energy, closing the distance before they could react. The fight was brief, but intense, his newfound strength proving more than a match for their weapons. As he continued towards the auxiliary control room, Chris felt the station shudder beneath his feet. The artificial gravity fluctuated again, and for a moment he found himself floating before being slammed back to the floor. He finally reached the auxiliary control room, his heart pounding as he saw Rieger and Aiden already there. But his relief was short-lived as he took in the scene before him. Aiden, now appearing to be the size of a young teenager, stood at a control panel, his hands moving with impossible speed over the interfaces. Rieger watched in a mix of awe and fear as their child manipulated systems far beyond the understanding of either human or Evora engineers. "He's stabilizing the station," Rieger explained, her voice filled with wonder and concern. "But Chris, I don't know how he's doing it. It's like he's become part of the system itself." Before Chris could respond, a voice boomed over the station's communication system. "This is Krellvox of the Purity Coalition. We have control of the main command center and are altering the station's orbit. Unless the hybrid child is surrendered to us immediately, we will initiate the self-destruct sequence." Chris moved to Aiden's side, watching as his son's eyes flickered with streams of data. "Aiden," he said softly, "can you hear me?" Aiden turned, his eyes focusing on his father with an intensity that took Chris's breath away. When he spoke, his voice seemed to resonate with the hum of the station itself. "I can stop them, Dad," Aiden said, "but I don't know what will happen to me if I do." Chris looked at Rieger, seeing his own conflict mirrored in her compound eyes. They had always known their child was special, but this was beyond anything they had imagined. The fate of everyone on the station, perhaps the future of human-Evora relations itself, now rested on their decision. As alarms blared and the station shuddered around them, Chris realized they were out of time. Whatever choice they made, the consequences would reshape their lives, and possibly the course of two civilizations, forever. Chris looked at Rieger, their eyes meeting in silent understanding. They had always known Aiden was extraordinary, but now the full extent of his abilities was becoming clear. With a nod, Chris turned to his son. "Aiden, we trust you. Do what you need to do." Aiden's eyes flickered with gratitude and dedication. He stepped forward, placing his hands on the nearest control panel. The moment his fingers made contact, the room hummed with energy. Aiden's eyes began to glow, emitting an otherworldly light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the station's systems. Chris and Rieger watched in awe as their son's body began to emit a soft, pulsating radiance. It was as if Aiden had become a living conduit, channeling the very essence of the station through his hybrid form. The auxiliary control room's screens came to life, displaying a dizzying array of data streams and system diagnostics. Aiden's fingers danced across the interface, moving with impossible speed and precision. His eyes darted back and forth, taking in information at a rate that no human or Evora could match. Suddenly, the door burst open. Major Thompson and his team rushed in, weapons at the ready. They skidded to a halt, transfixed by the sight of Aiden interfacing with the station's systems. "What in the world?" Thompson breathed, his eyes wide with disbelief. Before anyone could respond, another group of intruders stormed the room. Krelvox, flanked by his remaining Purity Coalition forces, entered with weapons raised. "Step away from the controls," Krelvox demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and awe. Chris and Major Thompson moved instinctively, positioning themselves between the intruders and Aiden. Rieger crouched protectively near her son, her antennae twitching with nervous energy. The room crackled with tension as both sides faced off, neither willing to back down. Aiden, seemingly oblivious to the standoff, continued his work. His body glowed brighter, the light pulsing in sync with the station's emergency beacons. Suddenly, Aiden's voice echoed through the station's communication systems. It resonated with a depth and clarity that sent shivers down Chris's spine. "Humans and Evora," Aiden's voice rang out in both languages simultaneously. "We stand at a crossroads. Our differences have brought us to the brink of destruction, but our similarities can lead us to a future brighter than either of our species could achieve alone." As Aiden spoke, the pulsing light emanating from his body intensified. The Coalition forces lowered their weapons slightly, captivated by the spectacle before them. "I am the bridge between our worlds," Aiden continued, his voice filled with compassion and wisdom beyond his years. "In me, you see the potential of what we can become together. We need not fear our differences, but embrace them. Unity does not mean uniformity. It is in our diversity that we find strength." Krelvox's grip on his weapon loosened, his eyes fixed on Aiden. The living embodiment of everything he had feared and fought against stood before him, radiating not threat but hope. As Aiden's message reverberated through the station, the screens in the control room showed the self-destruct sequence grinding to a halt. With mere seconds to spare, the countdown froze. A collective sigh of relief washed over the room. The immediate danger had passed, but the tension remained palpable. Aiden's glow began to fade, and his legs buckled beneath him. Chris rushed forward, catching his son before he hit the ground. Cradling Aiden in his arms, Chris marveled at how light he felt despite his now teenage-like appearance. The Purity Coalition forces, moved by Aiden's words and actions, began to lower their weapons. Krelvox, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, took a hesitant step forward. I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How can this be?" Major Thompson moved cautiously towards Krelvox, his own weapon lowered but ready. "Sometimes understanding comes after acceptance," he said. "Your actions today nearly cost countless lives. Are you willing to consider that your beliefs might be wrong?" Krelvox looked from Thompson to Aiden, then to Chris and Rieger. His gaze lingered on the family, taking in the unmistakable love and protectiveness they showed for each other. With a heavy sigh, Krelvox placed his weapon on the ground. "I surrender," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I need to rethink everything." As the Coalition forces followed their leader's example, laying down their arms, Chris felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He looked down at Aiden, who stirred weakly in his arms. "Did it work?" Aiden asked, his voice barely audible. Chris smiled, tears welling in his eyes. "Yes, son, you did it. You saved us all." Rhaegor moved to Chris's side, placing a gentle hand on Aiden's forehead. Her antenna quivered with a mix of concern and pride. "Rest now, little one," she chittered softly. "You've done more than we could have ever imagined." As medical teams rushed into the control room to tend to the injured and assess the damage, Chris and Rhaegar found themselves at the center of a whirlwind of activity. Scientists, diplomats, and security personnel swarmed around them, all eager to understand what had transpired. Dr. Rodriguez pushed her way through the crowd, her eyes wide as she took in Aiden's transformed appearance. "We need to get him to the medical bay immediately," she said, already running scans with her portable device. The amount of energy he expended, we need to monitor him closely. As they made their way through the damaged corridors of the station, Chris couldn't help but feel that everything had changed. The future that had seemed so uncertain now felt full of possibility. He looked at Rhaegar, seeing his own mix of exhaustion and hope reflected in her compound eyes. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family and as a bridge between two worlds. The Orbital station, once a symbol of division, now held the promise of a new era of cooperation and understanding. As they entered the medical bay, alarms still blaring in the distance and the station's crew scrambling to restore full functionality, Chris knew that their journey was nowhere near the end. But for the first time since Aiden's birth, he felt a sense of true optimism about what the future might hold.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.